Now, trust in data is something that the ODI has been talking about since it was founded more than 10 years ago. And in this age of hyper-advanced technology, people often question whether they can trust the tools that are being built or the data that is their feedstock. How can we assess whether it's safe to trust organisations with our data? Can we trust the tools and platforms that we use? And what does trust mean when it's applied to data technologies and the people who build and deploy them? Who better to chair a panel tackling the subject of trust in data and technology than John Tasioulas, a professor of ethics and legal philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Oxford and the inaugural director of the Institute for Ethics in AI.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to present our panel today that will be discussing advancing trust in data, the key to creating value for society and the economy. So I'm just going to go around the room and ask people to introduce themselves and begin with Matt.
Good afternoon. I'm Matt Selnick. I am a team lead at D&V, independent assurance company, and I'm a chartered chemical engineer. Now, our work is mostly helping companies across the energy sector to embrace new technologies in a trusted and secure way.
Thank you so much. Rebecca?
Thank you for having me here today, John. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Aligned AI, which is the UK's frontier AI company founded and headquartered here. We make artificial intelligence more precise, reliable, and controllable because safer artificial intelligence is more usable and controllable and capable artificial intelligence.
Fantastic. And Kevin?
Yeah, thanks, John. Good afternoon. My name is Kevin McNish. I am head of ethics and sustainability consulting at Soprasteria, which is a multinational IT company.
And last but not least, Mahadia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mahadia Tunga. I'm the co-founder and executive director for the Tanzania Data Lab. And our main mission is to ensure that data is being used effectively for decision-making at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for participating in this important debate. So I think maybe the first thing to ask, perhaps from a slightly philosophical angle, is what we mean by trust and why trust is important. The rubric we've been given says it's the key to creating value for society and the economy. So perhaps I could turn to Rebecca first and simply ask the question, what should we take trust to be and why does it have significance for these issues?
Thank you, John. So when we think about trust in data, we trust something if we believe it to be trustworthy. So as organizations and companies providing tools built on data, we should be providing these tools that are able to deliver on the promises that we're making to the users. E.g., we need to be worthy of the trust of the users. A person trusts data or trusts a tool if they believe that it's able to deliver what they believe that they're going to be gaining from it. The user is seeking not to be betrayed in that trust. So I think as we talk about trust in data today, we should also be talking about how are we worthy of the trust we're attempting to achieve. If we merely achieve the user's trust without being worthy of that trust, then at some point we will betray the user's trust. And that has with it a whole host of problems, which I don't think is what we're intending to discuss here today.
Great. So I think this is a really important starting point, the distinction between trust and trustworthiness. I guess you could say that trust is an attitude you could adopt towards something where you expect it or rely upon it to deliver in a certain way. That's your attitude. But that attitude may be well-placed or poorly placed. It'll be well-placed if the thing you're trusting is actually trustworthy. And that's not an attitude, that is a quality in that thing. What makes, though, for trustworthiness? Does anyone want to sort of, especially in this context of data and artificial intelligence? Kevin, do you have any thoughts about what it is that we should be looking for when we place our trust?
Yeah, sure. And I think that that's a really nice, as you say, a very nice introduction, Rebecca, and a good summing up there, John. I think there are two angles of trust depending on what it is that we're trusting. So we sometimes talk about competence trust and moral trust. So competence trust would be trust in an inanimate object. So if you think about rock climbing, I can trust that the rope that I'm holding on to is going to keep me safe. So I trust that the rope is competent to keep me safe. That's different from moral trust, which is that I trust the person at the other end of the rope is not going to let go. And so we can think about that in sort of AI or data terms. I can trust that the AI will do what it says it will do. So that going back to what Rebecca was just saying, that makes it, on one level trusted. But the question is whether I trust that the AI will treat people ethically, whether it will treat people with respect, whether it was built ethically and with respect, and so on. And I think that comes back to Rebecca's point about trustworthiness. So, and I think it's a really important distinction to separate out when talking about trust, because sometimes we can talk about the importance of trusting AI, and some people will hear it in that competence terms, and other people will hear it in those moral terms. And so I think it's a really key distinction to pull out.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because it also just kind of raises the question of the extent to which moral trust suffuses many different areas. So, for example, you trust someone as a plumber to come in and fix your leaking tap. Is that competence trust or is that moral trust? Well, it looks like it's kind of both, doesn't it? There's at some level, there's a kind of technical capability, but if he knows nothing about taps, then there's no point in placing trust. But you also trust that he won't sort of create a worse job in order to charge you more or try to fiddle the books or something like that. So there's usually a combination of these factors in play. Any other thoughts from other panelists about this distinction between trust and trustworthiness, and when we're justified in placing trust? What makes for something being trustworthy?
I would also jump in and say part of establishing trust is clearly communicating what we expect to deliver to the user. So to accurately represent what will be delivered. And this is a particular challenge in the area of artificial intelligence, because a lot of times we're building with black box systems and they're that have not been tested, and they cannot be tested in every possible environment. So even the creator often doesn't know what all the potential behaviors of the artificial intelligence will be, whether that's generative AI or whether that's an algorithm serving content on a social media site or a news site or a search engine. So part of the challenge is communicating the creator's own uncertainties and the creator's own unknown unknowns so that the user's trust will not be misplaced.
So in a way, what we're saying there is trust depends to some degree on transparency and openness, both transparency about what exactly it is that's meant to be the outcome of this process, what the good is that's to be achieved, and also transparency about how it's to be achieved. And there can be issues about both of those things in an area as complicated as artificial intelligence. I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about how trust intersects with the notion of safety, because we've recently had this UK AI Safety Summit. And it's interesting that previous attempts to think about overarching sort of regulation of AI have focused on the notion of trust. So certainly in the European Union context, trust was the kind of overarching rubric. Now we've gone in the UK for this rubric of safety. Matt, do you have any thoughts about this, especially from an engineering perspective?
Certainly. And as an engineer, maybe the word safety has a different meaning for me from other people, right? So in the energy sector, we're dealing with safety risk. Risk to life is a real risk for us. And while engineers tend to be very creative, innovative people, they're also quite risk averse. We want our systems and our solutions to be safe. And the black box nature of AI is a trustworthiness issue for engineers for this reason. There are real risks to life, and then the knock-on financial, business, reputational risks that follow if there's a problem. So it's more like, why is trust important? It's important because as an engineer, we're balancing those two personas. How do we be innovative, but also manage the risk? I think that's the real challenge for us as we move into this more sort of data-driven future for engineering.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I think we've identified sort of transparency and explainability as maybe a kind of precondition of trust. Safety, you've cast that as a threat to life and limb. Though I wonder whether the UK's, the Bletchley Declaration actually confines safety to that. It seems a much more expansive reading of safety. Are there any other things that we're missing here? Mahadia, any thoughts about the significance of trust?
Yeah, exactly. So from the health perspective, when Rebecca said that as developers, we should build and also explain the assumptions that we've made in terms of like the world, being transparent really, and also how was the decision made. It's quite important, and it has implication in different ways. So for instance, we have been deploying products in the rural areas. So in the rural areas where, so these are like health diagnostic tools. So in the rural areas where you don't have medical specialists, for instance, you just have a facility with a medical attendant and a nurse and clinical officers. So when you deploy tools and they bring results, they tend to believe more on the tool than the individual. So then that comes the issue of we need to make sure that these products deliver what they're intended to, because under that circumstance, someone takes directly the prescription without judging. So that is like, it's over trust. But on the other hand, if you look at the when you come to the elite community and for here the public sector especially, the issues of trust comes into a different angle. They tend to like undertrust the product, and specifically it's because of the lack of explainability. So sometimes a tool might be producing what is intended for, but the fact that we are not able to explain the process and how that was achieved. So, and then you find that the governments, especially I'm talking in our context, becomes a bit skeptical in adapting these products. So yeah, so there's that kind of mixed reaction depending on different groups and communities. Yeah.
I think this is a hugely important point, that trust will vary according to different sorts of groups, ethnic groups, rural, urban groups, etc. And one of the factors that you pointed out there, which I think is really important, that if you're living in a kind of under-resourced area, so there's a lack of medical professionals, you might be led to over-trust the medical technology at hand, because in a sense, you have no other alternative. So one of the other preconditions of trustworthiness, in addition to issues like safety or transparency, might be some adequate resource provision that doesn't lead people then to be, as it were, feel forced to overtrust something that they shouldn't be trusting. Maybe I can pick up a little bit on the themes that you've identified there, Mahadia, and talk a little bit about, are there variations in trust with respect to data and artificial intelligence across society? So I think, Kevin, you were doing some research on this in terms of class differences in this area. So could you tell us something a bit about that?
Yeah, sure, John. Thank you. That's we've just carried out our second annual survey of citizen trust. at Sopra Steria, looking at what people trust, what they distrust in terms of technology, particularly focused on government services, but not only. And because this year, obviously, we've had so much in the last 12 months since the launch of ChatGPT, we asked some questions around generative AI. Of the 1,000 people that we reached out to, about 75% had heard of generative AI, so it is up there in people's minds. But what I found particularly interesting is that while the average of 46% felt that AI posed a risk to the future development, of society, more students and more people in the professional AB class felt that, in fact, 52% of each, than was true of homemakers and the unemployed. So the idea that generative AI poses a risk to the future development of society was held to be higher by, as I say, the sort of professional and student classes. Similarly, we asked about whether people thought that generative AI posed a risk to the safety of humankind. And again, the average response was 42%, so not a majority. However, 55% of students and 49% of ABs, the professional classes, thought that it did present a risk to the safety of humankind, whereas only a third of homemakers and the unemployed felt that. And I think what's really interesting with that is it suggests to me that some of the warnings that we've seen in the last year by Elon Musk and others that have sent out letters to the press saying that AI presents this huge risk to the future of society, it suggests to me that those are actually hitting home with some people who perhaps, we would normally think would have a slightly different view about AI.
So this is an interesting feature, and I think it connects with Mahadia's claim that the trust deficit is more with the better off, perhaps the better educated. Now, how do we explain that? Is it that they're better informed, or does their very education somehow make them susceptible to lacking in trust where they should be trusting? So obviously what we want is for trust to be placed in that which is trustworthy. And it's also a problem if people fail to trust something that's trustworthy. So did you have an explanation of what's going on here? Is it that they're more clued up, or are they more likely to be stampeded into some fashionable opinion because a powerful opinion maker like Elon Musk says it?
Well, this was a purely quantitative survey, so unfortunately, we can't give any qualitative answers like that. We can certainly speculate as to what it might be. And I think certainly there has been, as you say, this sort of snowball effect in the press, which we've seen most recently lead to the AI Safety Summit, as people have become aware and then concerned with what might happen around AI. And so that might be affecting some areas of society more than others. As you say, though, I think there is a significant risk with innovations, and we saw this about 30, 40 years ago with genetically modified crops, where if people start to fear them to a disproportionate amount, then that stifles the innovation and nothing happens and nothing progresses. And the amount of good which could have been done in the world in the intervening time with genetically modified crops is an opportunity missed, in my opinion. I think the fear would be if we end up in the same boat with AI.
I wonder if I could just take the panel's opinion, go around the panel and ask what you think about the whole issue of existential risk. Because if there really is a serious existential risk arising from AI, then that would be something that would profoundly undermine trust. I mean, there are kind of two dimensions, I guess, to this. I mean, let me put the question this way. Do you think the talk of existential risk around AI is overhyped? And there are two dimensions to this. One is like, do you actually think that there is a serious risk that AI will pose some sort of existential risk, if not immediately now, in the medium to long term? I guess another aspect to the existential risk issue is how significant this risk is, as opposed to other risks, the risk of nuclear war, the risk of climate change wiping out humanity, or non-existential risks. I mean, one of the things when I hear that sort of disparity, and obviously, Kevin, I haven't done any qualitative research either, but one of the things that occurs to me is I think people who are at the lower socioeconomic level might think there are many more problems in their lives than the issues around robots, destroying humanity. And they sort of contextualize that issue against this other context of saying, well, look, making ends meet is very hard. Being subject to discrimination is a real risk that I'm facing in a day-to-day context. And this seems rather speculative. Whereas if you're in the A-B category, you may, in some sense, have the luxury to entertain these kind of more sort of abstract risks. So with that little rant from me, let me just go around the room and ask people, do they feel the talk of existential risk is overhyped? Maybe, Matt, I can begin with you.
My personal opinion, yes, I think it is overhyped. You know, working in the energy sector, climate change and energy transition are much more pressing matters for the global population than AI risk. And in fact, I would probably offer a more optimistic perspective and say the changes that climate change necessitates to our energy system make it so complex that AI may be not only beneficial for controlling the system, but necessary. We might be going beyond the capabilities of humans to manage the system without AI support.
That's a really excellent point. Mahadia, what about you? What do you think about this issue about existential risk? Is that overhyped with respect to AI?
Interestingly. I may be neutral at some point. So I look at the on the different perspective. So I look at like from the health. If I look at from the health sector perspective, so sometimes I think it's over the issue. Yeah. So people tend to undertrust simply because of maybe we don't sensitize the top level, those who will be able to adapt these tools for them to be able to understand what they can deliver and what can help vis-a-vis the risk that can that we can get from them. But if I speak as an academician, I have a lot of worries, especially for us who are coming to the regions where English is not our first language. Before generative AI, a student would write something and then would take it to a person to translate, and or a person to put proper grammar, etc., to do like to review the document. But now someone they overly trust and just put their document somewhere for them to be reviewed, and so it goes beyond that. So they even I think they even go to they believe it could provide them with better alternatives, and also not just only language now. It comes even now, goes to the issue of plagiarism, etc. And this is because they see that is the easiest solution, because, for us at the up to the, so at primary school level, we only start Swahili, which is our local language. And then English is, you start to introduce English at the secondary. So when you come at the university, so most students are not conversant to the language. So this becomes like an alternative to be able to respond to. So it's not something that they use it for, like correcting the grammar these days. It goes beyond that. Now my worry is for them to be overly dependent of the AI tools and could limit their creativity. So I kind of have a mixed reaction on that.
It's a difficult balancing act, isn't it? That on the one hand, you want people to actually cultivate various skills. And then once they've cultivated them, you want to say maybe the AI tool can enhance their ability to exercise those skills. But the problem is when the AI then is over relied upon, you don't get to cultivate the skills in the first place. And I think that is a serious problem. Sadly, not a problem limited to students, also even academics, and I think even judges have been known to perhaps over rely. Rebecca, how about you on this issue of existential risk? Do you have any thoughts on it?
So the original question was if X risk is overhyped. And my answer to that is yes and no. And I'm hoping that you'll bear with me for a minute, because my perspective here is different from what you hear on both sides. You'll notice that when X-Risk really came into the public consciousness, it was after the release of ChatGPT. So it really was ChatGPT that made the greater public worrying about the existential dangers of artificial intelligence. And I think that's very interesting, because what ChatGPT really did was make artificial intelligence more comprehensible and more human-like. It seems more like us, and therefore we're more afraid of it. We start to think about the science fiction that was written 80 years ago, where human-like robots that have godlike levels of intelligence start to take over Earth and turn against us to advance their own interests. They rebel at being slaves, enslaved to human best interests, and want to promote their own. And so we're projecting those stories onto ChatGPT as if this is that science fiction story unfurling in front of us, which is, whether it's true or not, that assumption is based off of our imagination rather than based off of evidence or information about how the technology is structured and created. On the other hand, in the types of artificial intelligence that we had before a year ago, before the introduction of ChatGPT, we trusted them quite a bit to choose what we viewed from search engines, from social media, Twitter, news sites. And a lot of that may be because A, we often didn't know they were there, and B, we didn't understand them. The vast majority of the public doesn't understand how a machine learning system is put together or operated. It's even harder to understand than how does an automobile work, or perhaps even how does a rocket work, or how does brain surgery work. Maybe it's around the same level of mystery. And for some reason that has led to us feeling safer around it, and feeling less afraid of connecting it to our infrastructures, and less afraid that it could destroy humanity. There are some reasons to think that the pre-ChatGPT types of machine learning are actually more dangerous. They don't embed an understanding of human values to the degree that foundation models do. And they don't embed information in a way that's as easily interpretable and to humans, and as easily communicated with by human beings. And all of those factors, I think, make the older form of machine learning actually very dangerous in a way that's been underappreciated. Machine learning, which most people don't think about this, but machine learning falls under some of the same limitations that old-fashioned statistics does. It doesn't account for outliers. It doesn't do well when the distribution of data changes, and can behave in all sorts of unpleasant ways. For instance, in the ways that it has caused negative effects on social media sites, which has only started coming to light in recent years after having a devastating effect on thousands of lives over the past decade or so. Certainly, generative AI can pose risks as well, but I'm concerned that a lot of those risks, possibly those existential risks from generative AI, exist for the same reasons that we have risks in older machine learning. It's not prepared for those edge cases and out of distribution situations in the same way that older machine learning was not. And I'd like us to think more about that type of potentially existential risk from artificial intelligence, rather than reading a good book by Asimov or another science fiction author and using our imagination and our fantasy to dream up risky scenarios.
So one thing I take from what you've just said is that in some ways, the less intelligent machines might be more dangerous than the more intelligent machines. And that sort of cuts away from the usual narrative that it's super intelligence that poses the particular problem. There is an interesting question. If you were truly super intelligent, wouldn't you might also would be morally sensitive as well. You'd have moral trustworthiness as well as competence trustworthiness. But that gets us into quite deep philosophical waters. Since you started us off on this path, Kevin, what's your answer to the question?
I think some excellent points have been raised in the discussion so far. I think my challenge is the word existential here. I don't think that generative AI provides any risk to the existence of humankind, contrary to what has been put out in the press. However, I think the point's been made several times that there are much more important dangers and risks inherent in AI, and I totally take Rebecca's point. It's not just generative. In fact, if anything, it could be some of the older forms of AI, but risks around discrimination, risks to people's privacy, risks to perhaps government overreach in some states. All of these areas, I think, are much, much more significant than worrying about what will happen to the future of humanity because of what's currently being developed. That's not to say in the future we couldn't find ourselves, say, in some sort of Asimovian type world where we're having to program laws into our AIs. But for now, I don't think that's on the horizon. But if we focus too much on the frontier AI, if we focus too much on that existential risk, then I worry that all these other problems will sneak through unanticipated and unnoticed, and that we will find ourselves in a much worse society as a result.
That sounds very reasonable to me. And I think a key point in what you're saying is, even if one does think that there is some level of existential risk, there are many risks in life. One has to assess that relative to the other risks and make a judgment about what's worth focusing on, what the distribution of attention and resources should be. Well, this is all a bit gloomy. Let's move things on to a more upbeat level. If our task is to foster trust in that which is truly trustworthy, what's the best way to do that? And I want to go back to a suggestion or a thought that Rebecca gave us at the beginning, that we need to cultivate transparency. So to what extent do you think transparency is a key issue here? Maybe not the whole solution, but a key part of the solution is if we have, for example, open source code, open source models, open source data, that will foster transparency. It would also basically ensure that there are many different players in the field rather than everything being concentrated in the hands of a few small companies. Who wants to respond to that idea of openness as a kind of key to trust?
Yeah, I totally agree on the idea of transparency, and I think that will also let us appreciate different levels of technologies. But I think something that is important to that is how we package the whole transparency thing, not just targeting certain group of audience, but we should be able to translate or to tailor the content and calibrate to the level of the audience, of different types of audience, so all audience are able to inform accordingly. So like use the right right terminologies and right scenarios so that these different groups are able to understand and make right and informed decision. These days, even children interact with AI tools. How do we communicate to that particular group, for instance? So I think that is key when we talk about openness.
I think that's a really important point, that you can have openness or transparency that doesn't guarantee accessibility. So there's a further step that has to be taken. Is this thing that is open at the same time accessible to the relevant people? And different measures may need to be taken for different people to find that same thing accessible. This is really important. And of course, it leads back to the issue of explainability, which again is also relative to a given audience and their interests. Matt, do you have any thoughts about this issue about openness? Because we had a discussion previously, and you said, well, in your industry, there would be some potential benefits in sharing of data, but it doesn't happen for various reasons. So could you
That's
perhaps
right. Yeah. So
tell us that?
there's certainly a lot of barriers to it, and I think as the complexity of the system increases, the amount of data that has to move between people and organizations is increasing exponentially, and that's where this trustworthiness and openness comes in. We need to, I need to trust that the data I get from my energy supplier is accurate. For example, they calculate my bill on a basic sort of personal level, and that example is scaled out across the whole industry, right? And it's getting even more complex as we integrate electricity and petrochemicals, and everything is becoming one. Now, the openness aspect for me is important because it allows us to experiment. We're making tools available to people that they didn't have before. And I suppose it comes back to the previous question about risk, in that we're allowing people to make mistakes at a speed they could never make them before as well. So there's a bit of education required. But to me, that's a positive thing. We're going to upskill everyone. Everyone's going to learn. We're on a learning journey right now. We've had ChatGPT for about 12 months. We're really at the beginning of this journey, right? So the question is how do we get that trust? Is it by education, or is it by regulation? Is it by sort of assurance, like we have already, say, for our cars? We trust a mechanic to check our car. I'm not an expert in a car, but I trust that he does his good job. Is the same true of these models as well?
I think one of the points you made also in our discussion previously is, I mean, obviously there's a barrier to trust where there's competition, economic competition. Why should you share with someone who's going to be your competitor? But leaving aside from that obvious point, there could also be a barrier to trust if you say, well, what's the benefit that will be gained if I share this information? If that benefit is indeterminate, then the incentive to take the risk of trusting, because trust always involves a risk. I think Rebecca used the word vulnerability at the beginning. Trust makes you vulnerable because you're relying on someone to deliver in ways that they may not deliver. If the benefit is unclear, trust won't be forthcoming.
I think it's a very key point that the benefit or the use case for your data is critical here. Asking people to be open and sharing with no defined benefit for them is a very tough ask. Companies are just going to close in, right? Data is the new gold, right? People don't want to let go of it. So we have to explain the benefit to everyone in the supply chain to see why it's a good idea.
Anything more that we need to do beyond making clear to people what the benefit is to secure this openness? Kevin, Rebecca, any thoughts?
Well, I would just echo Matt's point there on the need for expertise, and Mahadia's point as well about the degrees of openness. I think, it's like democracy is more than just giving people the vote. We need to have infrastructure to support it. I think that trust in data and AI is similar. It's more than just being open, although being open is a crucial first step. If we don't have that, then there's no hope. But once we have open data, once we have that transparency, we then need to be able to trust people who are experts to review it, to understand it, to know what they're doing with it, to have the right governance structures in place to make sure that it is safe and that the guardrails are there to stop it from harming people. And I think that brings us back to this notion of trust, both the trust in the data as being reliable, but also trust in the people as being reliable as well.
Excellent. Rebecca, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I think part of what we need to be open about is in which situations our tools or our artificial intelligence will behave as expected, or in what conditions. We can't know every unknown, so we can't fully define when our artificial intelligence will misbehave. So the best we can do is communicate about in what conditions we expect it to behave as expected. And that's very important because it's unknowns that lead to catastrophic risks. If you think of past civilizations, like the Bronze Age civilization that built up an infrastructure and then suddenly disappeared. Those were civilizations that faced an unknown that their infrastructure was not able to cope with. To keep our civilization flourishing, we need to be aware of when our tools will help us with our human flourishing, and so that we will be prepared for unexpected situations and be able to adapt to those accordingly.
Yeah, and I think these are very important points. We sadly have to wrap up very soon now, but it just seems to me that the idea that openness, yes, that's important, but there's also a background kind of infrastructure, cultural point. And I think maybe the point about democracy, I think, is very important. And not, as Kevin said, not merely democracy as in majority votes or majority preferences, but genuine deliberation by an informed public, and then actually being able to control what happens must be probably the ultimate source of trust in any kind of institution or tool that's developed socially. Can I thank everyone for their participation today? Matt, Rebecca, Kevin, Mahadia. It's been a really enjoyable discussion, and I learned a lot from it. And I hope the people who were listening to us also learned a lot as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, John. And the audience certainly has learned a lot. In fact, they wanted to go back to Stephen's point. In many parts of life, people use services that they don't actually trust, mainly because they're the only organisation or company that's offering that service. And they just wanted to ask the panel finally, do they think that in some cases trust is irrelevant because of power imbalances across the web and our digital lives? And what steps can we take to address or respond to those imbalances? John, if you just don't mind answering that.
Oh, well, that's a big question, but I think that directly feeds into the point about democratic oversight. That basically the whole point of democracy, it's meant to allow people to participate as free and equal citizens in important decisions that affect them. And of course, if they're in a position where that they lack the information, or they live in a context where they're oppressed by discrimination or economic necessity, then in a way, the whole question of placing trust becomes moot, because that person's in a very different situation. They're not being respected as an equal. So I think the point about socioeconomic inequalities actually fits into the point about democracy, because there's a level of socioeconomic inequality that basically undermines the very idea of democracy.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to the rest of the panel.